Okay.
Okay?
Yes.
Okay. All right. This week's Sedra, this coming week's Sedra, I should say, is Vayigash. It's also the last 2 days of Chanukah. So I would like to discuss both topics, to connect both topics. Now, in this week's Sedra, in a sense, Yosef reveals himself to his brothers, says, Ani Yosef, I'm Yosef, your brother, who you sold to be taken down to Egypt. But what was it, that emotional moment that, in a sense, compelled Yosef emotionally to reveal who he was, and in a sense to say enough is enough. It's time to make up. It was that Yosef said, that Yehuda said, the Avdecha Arei V'Sanar. I became a surety for the child, for Binyamin. Binyamin really was no child at that time, but the youngest is always a child. So the Avdecha Arei V'Sanar. So in a sense, Yosef saw the way my father explained it, that at that time, there was a recognition that the brothers were Balei Tshuva, because the Rambam, in discussing what is a Bal Tshuva Gomor, someone is a Bal Tshuva Gomor if he's in the exact same situation with the same people that he sinned, and he doesn't sin. In a sense, Binyamin was in place of Yosef, and the same concerns, it was a question of themselves, or Binyamin, of Yehuda and Binyamin. Yehuda is ready to serve as a servant for Yosef in Egypt in place of Binyamin. And Yehuda is ready to sacrifice himself. This is the ultimate tshuva. So at that point, Yosef tells the Egyptians to leave the room, and he reveals who he is to his brothers. Now, there's a very interesting medrash. My father would quote this medrash quite often. The medrash says, why is it that a Jew is called a Yehudi? Why isn't it called a Reuveni, a Shimoni? Levi, you could say, because Levi had certain tasks. So the answer is because Yehuda says, V'avdecha Arei V'Sanar. I am a surety. I gave myself over as a surety for Binyamin. Responsibility for my fellow Jew. I remember my father once speaking. He said, a Jew is a Jew. A Jew is somebody that's born from a mother who is Jewish. A Jew is somebody who underwent halachic gerus. But what is a Jew? A Jew is v'avdecha arei v'sanar, one who has responsibility. And I want to focus on what the idea is behind this. The Avdecha Arei V'Sanar. We say, Kol Yisrael Arei V'Imzeh Lezeh. Every Jew is responsible one for the other. What is behind this halacha? This is first of all, it bears, I have a responsibility, but because I have a responsibility, that allows me to help my friend perform the mitzvos. Even if I heard Kiddush already, I can make Kiddush for my friend, because to a certain degree, if my friend did not fulfill the mitzvah of Kiddush, I did not completely fulfill my mitzvah of Kiddush. So I am still required in the mitzvah of Kiddush. That's the concept of Arvus. The Arvus is that his requirement, his mitzvah, is part of my mitzvah as well. Now, there is a very interesting thought that my father mentioned in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak Volozhiner. It was to explain the opinion. There is an opinion that if somebody, the halach is that if somebody comes in contact with a dead body, doesn't make difference whether it's the dead body of a Jew or the dead body of a non-Jew, and he has physical contact, so he's comes tamei, he's contaminated. He can't go to the Beis HaMikdash. He can't unless he goes through a process of purification. But the halach is not just if one comes in contact with a dead body, but the halach applies even if you come into a room or a tent where there is a dead body. Why? Because the Torah says in Parshas Chukas, Adam tiyamos bo'el. An Adam, when he dies in a tent being a covering. So even if I'm in a room where there is someone who died, I am contaminated. I can't go to the temple in Jerusalem. And today we all suffer from this contamination. We all have been at funerals. So we're tamei mess. And because of that, but the halach is that there is a dispute. But according to some opinions, when it says Adam ki yamas b'hoel, it's talking about a Jew who dies in a tent. In other words, any human being who dies, and I come in physical contact with the body of that human being, so I become contaminated, because death contaminates. But if it's a Jew, even if I'm in the room, according to some opinions, with other opinions is it makes no difference, Jew or non-Jew. But according to some opinions, a Jew contaminates, the body of a Jew contaminates in a room, even if I did not come in contact with the body of that Jew who passed away. And the question is why? It says, Adam ki yamas b'hoel. And the way Reb Chaim Volozhiner explains the Gzeres HaKosov, because Adam is not just the singular man, but the word man has reference to the plural as well. And the only nation that is considered a nation, most nations are nations because individuals come together. But the Jewish nation is a nation because, from a halachic perspective, because we are a nation, and I am a Jew because I am part of that nation. So the concept of nationhood, from a halachic perspective, is much stronger in regard to the Jewish people than it is in regard to the non-Jews. And the word Adam is used not just in regard to an individual, but it can be used in regard to a group of men. So therefore, according to some opinions, that's talking about the Jewish nation. So this is the concept of the Jewish people as one unit. Now it's very interesting. Hillel, when someone, a non-Jew, came to Hillel to the great Tana Hillel, and wanted to undergo conversion to Judaism. But he offered Hillel a challenge. He said to Hillel, I want to undergo Judaism, but I want you to be able to tell me over the whole Torah when I'm standing on one leg. And when he came to Shammai, in a sense, said to him, he thought that he was making a joke. So Shammai, in a sense, had nothing to do with him. Whereas Hillel, and didn't accept him for conversion. And Hillel said to him, interestingly, he said, it says, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. You should like your neighbor like yourself. And the rest of the Torah is an explanation of that pasuk. All the other mitzvahs of the Torah are just an explanation of the mitzvah of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your friend as yourself. Now, how we can understand that? We can understand that the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is the foundation of the mitzvos bein adam l'chaveiro. It could serve as the foundation of the mitzvos that have to do with the relationship between one man and another man. But how could the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha serve as the foundation? And this is a question that Rashi asks. The Rishonim already asked it. How could the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your friend like yourself, serve as the foundation for the mitzvos bein adam l'makom, between man and God? How can it be the foundation for the mitzvah of davening, of praying? How could it be the foundation for the mitzvah of learning Torah? I fulfilled the mitzvah of learning Torah even when I learned by myself. How could it be the foundation for the mitzvah of eating matzah on Pesach? For eating eating in a sukkah, and for rabbinic mitzvahs? I assume that he included rabbinic mitzvahs also, like lighting Chanukah candles. So how can it serve as the foundation for these mitzvah? And this question could also ask, because the discussion among the Tanoim, what is a great principle of the Torah? And Rabbi Akiva's opinion was that a great principle of the Torah is the pasuk V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Love your friend as yourself. So we can understand again how it serves as the foundation for the mitzvos bein adam l'chaveiro, between man and his friend, between one person and another. But how does it serve as the foundation for the mitzvos bein adam l'makom, for the mitzvos that have to do with the relationship between you and God, the ritualistic mitzvahs, the mitzvahs of kashrus? How could the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha serve as a great principle of the Torah for that? And now it's very interesting regarding, and the Torah tells us that by Eglah Rufa, that's also in this week's Sedra, when Yosef, when a dead body is found and near a city, so the elders of the city and the elders and some members of the Sanhedrin, they come out, and Eglah Rufa, the whole process of Eglah Rufa is done, and the Skenim, the elders of the city, they have to say, Yodeinu lo shafchu es hadam hazeh, our hands did not spilled his blood. And the question is, the Gemara, the Medrash, they all raise the question: did anybody think that the elders of the city killed this person? He was killed by somebody else. And they said, and the answer is, we didn't. When they say Yadeinu lo shafchus adam hazeh, the elders are not saying we didn't kill him. No one suspects them of killing. But this person, there were reasons that this person was in a situation in which he was killed. In other words, there might have been a person that came into the city and no one took care of his needs. He didn't have food. He was lonely. We didn't accompany him back on the road. We didn't help him. And this led to the murder. Some say it has reference to the person who did the murder. Some say it has reference to the murdered victim. Whatever it might be. And the elders of the city have to say, and Reb Chaim would say that this is one of the basis, the mitzvah of tzedakah. Reb Chaim said it's not just the mitzvah on the individual. It's not just the mitzvah on me as an individual to get tzedakah, but there's a mitzvah on the community to take care of those who are impoverished, those who are in need. And need doesn't just mean monetary need. It doesn't just mean food. It can mean psychological need also. That's Levia. Accompaniment. When somebody is going on a journey, so you accompany him part of the way to give him a good feeling about himself. So the elders of the city have to declare we did not neglect that duty. And that's why Yadeinu lo shafchos hazam. We are not responsible for the spilling of blood. Why the elders of the city? I think the Rambam in Hilchos Malachim says that the Melech, the king, who leiv ha'am, the Jewish people are like one body, like one person, as we'll see. Are like one body, like one person. And the king, the leaders, they are the heart of that body. The word leiv, my father told me that he heard from Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky, that the word leiv in the Torah has a double meaning. It could mean the heart, and it could mean the brain also. So, and here, it could mean both. In other words, hu leiv ha'am, the king directs the thinking, but the heart is the symbol of feeling and emotion, sensitivity. Where does it come? It comes in Matan Torah. The Torah tells us that when the Jewish people camped at Sinai, Vayichan Shem Yisrael neged Ahor, the Jewish people, in a sense, set up camped, but it says it in the singular form. Generally, when the Torah talks about the Jewish people going from place to place in the desert, the Torah says Vayachanu in the plural form. But at Mount Sinai it was Vayichan in the singular form. Why is it with Vayichan? Ke'ish echad b'leiv echad. Because they were like one person with one heart. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Medrash says, let me use this opportunity to give them the Torah. So it seems that being like one person with one heart is a prerequisite for receiving the Torah. Why was it a prerequisite for receiving the Torah? The answer is, when we accepted the Torah, we didn't just accept the Torah for ourselves, but we accepted the Torah for all Jewish people. Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. It's true, the completion of that process was only when the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael. But the process of Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh, in terms of responsibility, of an obligation, of helping Jews fulfill the mitzvos, maybe in regard to punishment, that was only once they entered Eretz Yisrael. But in regard to helping Jews fulfill the mitzvahs of the Torah, that began at Sinai. So Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazeh. Each Jew has a responsibility for the other Jew. Now, how could we accept the Torah? How can we accept an obligation for somebody else? But if we Ke'ish Echad B'Lev Echad, we are like one person. But it's not enough to be Ke'ish Echad. It has to be Kalev Echad. We need that emotional feeling. It's not enough sympathy. You have to have the empathy. What is sympathy? Sympathy is I feel bad for him because he's in pain. Empathy is I feel his pain. So feeling someone's pain, that was a prerequisite for Kabbalas HaTorah. And that's the idea of a hafta l'reyacha kamocha, like this person. Can we understand the pasuk? Like your neighbor, kamocha, like you like yourself, because he is yourself. You have to consider him as if he is yourself. So that's the foundation for the acceptance of Torah. That's the foundation for the acceptance of Torah. So we understand how all the mitzvahs are included in the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha is the foundation of being a Jew. It's the foundation of being committed to the Torah. So it's a klal gadol b'Torah. It's a great principle in the Torah, and the rest of the Torah is just an explanation of the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, of loving your neighbor like yourself. And the Medrash says that was Yosef, the Yaakov, when the brothers came and told him, "Oh, Joseph Chai, that Joseph is alive and he is the Mishnah Lamelech." He was like the assistant to the king, the assistant king, more than assistant to the king. He was the assistant king. And he looked out of the window and he saw the agolos, the wagons that Joseph sent to bring him to Egypt. So the spirit of Yaakov became alive again. And the Medrash says because Yaakov, the last thing Yaakov learned with Joseph was the Parsha of Eglah Arufa, the parsha of what to do when a dead body is found outside the city, how the Skenei Hayir, the elders of the city, have to say, Yodeinu lo shafchu es adam hazeh, our hands did not spill this blood. And in a sense that when there was a person in the city, we understood the responsibility of taking care of them to feed them, taking care of them, giving them a place to stay, taking care of them, giving them emotional support. And when Yaakov certainly had the means to go down to Egypt himself, but when Yosef sent the wagons, it wasn't just the wagons. Yosef couldn't go to Eretz Canaan himself, but in a sense, this was his way of accompanying him, of taking care of Yaakov emotionally, in addition to giving him food on the road to Egypt. So he saw that Yosef remembered the lesson that he taught him that lo patrinu, we did not leave him go without food to eat, without something to drink, without a place to sleep, and without accompaniment. So he recognized that it was really Yosef. It wasn't just the person Yosef. It wasn't just the person Yosef, but it was the Yosef that he knew. It wasn't just the assistant to the king, the assistant king. It was the Yosef, the son of Yaakov, who learned Torah by Yaakov. And in a sense, he saw that Yosef had this attitude. Yosef at that point was ready to become the leader of the Shvatim. And both him, Yosef, the Medrash Rabbi talks about Yosef being king and Yehuda being king. They both had these qualities of leadership, of being Leiv Ha'am. The idea that the Ziknei Ha'am, the Ziknei Ha'yir, the leaders of the city, the leaders of the nation, being the Leiv Ha'am. That's the idea of responsibility. Ba'avdecha oreh b'sanar. And so now it's interesting that now there's a Ritva, very interesting Ritva. The Ritva says, we know that under ideal circumstances, I actually, about a week and a half ago, I had to speak at an educational organization here in Chicago. And about Chanukah. So some of the thoughts that I'm going to express now, I expressed at that time. The Ritva says that that the Gemara mentions that when somebody under ideal circumstances or laboratory conditions, so the mezuzah is on the right side of the door, the Chanukah candles are on the left side of the door, and the Ritva says the Balabayas goes between the two of them wearing a talis mitzuyetzes, wearing a talis that has tzitzis on it. And the question is, okay, some Rishonim mentioned the pasuk because chut hamishulas lo b'heri yinasei. So this is significant if a string has 3 chords, it's a stronger string. But what's the significance? We understand the significance of mezuzah because we want to light the candles at the Pesach at the doorway. I mentioned a number of times here also because the Greeks used the doorway. From the Medrash, it seems the Greeks used the doorway to prevent the Jewish people from observing mitzvahs in their houses. They did not allow the Jews to close the door or lock the door of their house. So they should be in fear and not do mitzvahs HaTorah. So we light the candle at the doorway opposite the mezuzah. But what's the significance of wearing a tala mitzuyetzes? So I mentioned at that time that and I mentioned in the shir here, I think also the Torah tells us in Parshas Noach that Noach, after the flood, so he planted a vine that had fruit on it, that had grapes, and he made wine, and he drank the wine and became drunk. And in a sense, he acted in an unbecoming manner. He took off his clothes, and he was naked. and Ham and Canaan made fun of him. And then Shem and Yefes heard about it, and without looking at him, they wanted to show him kavod. They came and they covered him up with clothes, with a robe. And because of this, Shem, who is the ancestor of the Jewish people, we talk about the yeshiva of Shem Ve'aver. So Shem and Yefes was the ancestor of Greece. They went and they covered Noah up. The Medrash says that Shem initiated the process. So, but the question is, and as a result of that, they were rewarded. Yefes got kfura, got burial. Some say burial in Eretz Yisrael. In other words, for the descendants or one of the descendants of Yefes who will be involved in the war of Gog and Magog, will be buried in Eretz Yisrael. And some say just burial. They don't mention Eretz Yisrael. There are different texts of Midrashim on this, but it has to do with burial. And Shem got the mitzvah of tzitzis. And it's somewhat, we have to understand, what is the significance of the mitzvah of tzitzis? And I should point out that my uncle says in the shiurim, not in this regard, but he mentions that there are two separate mitzvahs of tzitzis. You see, our custom is when you put on a talis, you say lehisatef tzitzis. When you put a talis cotton on, you say al mitzvah tzitzis. And my uncle said, of course, this is not true necessarily according to all Rishonim, that the mitzvah, there are two separate mitzvahs of tzitzis. One is a mitzvah of covering yourself. That's lehisatef tzitzis. That's one what we call a talis gadol. But then there is a mitzvah of dilin tasaloch. That's a mitzvah not so much of wearing the tzitzis, but putting tzitzis on a beged, on clothes that have four corners. But it's the way we paskin, it's only considered clothes while you're wearing it. As a matter of fact, Rabbeinu Tosfos in Chulin says that if somebody wears clothes that doesn't belong to him, so if he makes the bracha, it's better not to make the bracha, and it has tzitzis on it, it's not a bracha of atola. It's not, in other words, because it's not a halacha, it's a halacha that the clothes require tzitzis. But the mitzvah of so we make our mitzvah tzitzis. We make our mitzvah tzitzis when it's a talis cotton. But lehisatef tzitzis, that's wearing. That's a maisa of the gavra of wearing tzitzis. That's the talis gadol. That's the mitzvah of talis gadol. So the mitzvah. So by Shem was rewarded because he covered up Noach. So he got the mitzvah of tzitzis. But the question is, why is it that Yefes gets as a reward kfura, burial, special burial, whatever it is, honored burial? And that Yefes gets honored burial, and Shem gets the mitzvah of talis with tzitzis. Why is it that way? Why the difference? After all, they did the same thing. My uncle suggests it's because, so my uncle says there was a difference, but I don't think he explains it. I would like to go into length into explaining it. My uncle said that, this is what I read in the notes that were printed by some of the Talmidim, some of his students, that by Yefes, why did he cover up Noach? He covered up Noach because my uncle used the word nit-shame. It did not look nice. Shem covered up Noach. Why? Because of tznius. But the question is, and at least in the notes that I read, my uncle did not, it wasn't mentioned how we distinguish at length, it's not mentioned at length, how to distinguish between the concept of nit-shame, it's not nice, and the idea of tznius. What is the idea of tznius versus nit-shame? It's not nice, not proper. What's the difference between the two? Now, and then I was troubled. My uncle, at least in these notes, he didn't raise that question. Yefes is the ancestor of Greece. Greece, if you look at Greece art, which is not something I would advise, but their statues, the statues they have, on the contrary, nudity, not being covered up, is essential to Greek art. So it's strange, all of a sudden, Yefes goes ahead and helps Shem in covering up Noach in his nakedness. How are we to understand it? But the answer is Greece reveres the body. Everything is from the perspective of the body. When someone is in a drunken stupor, so it's a disgrace to the body. If someone is in an athletic position, then on the contrary, nudity might be considered giving honor to the body from the perspective of Yefes, from the perspective of Greece. Whereas Shem, it isn't the body that's important. It's the association between the body and the neshama, the soul. And according to almost all the Mefarshim, the Rambam being the exception, what is the neshama? The neshama is the chelek Elokai mimal. It is the godliness that hovers. If I have to use Reb Chaim Volozhiner's terms, that hovers over the human being, over the head of the human being. According to the Baal Tanya, it enters the human being. So the neshama, the chelek Elokai mimal, because of that, the body has to be covered to give respect to the body as, in a sense, the anchor of the neshama of the chelek Elokai mimal. And even according to the Rambam, that the neshama is not chelek Elokai mimal. It's something that was created by God. It's a creation. But nevertheless, man has to know that he's constantly in the presence of God. So you cover yourself up because you're in the presence of God. Just as Adam and Chava, when they heard HaKadosh Baruch Hu approaching them after the Aveira, so they covered themselves up. So part of the idea of tznius is the idea of recognition that I am standing in the presence of God. And that's why Shem. So though Shem and Yefes were partners in covering Noah up, but it was for altogether two different reasons. Noah covering Noah up. Yefes, because it was his drunken stupor. It did not give honor to the body. Shem, it was because we are always in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, I would like to go more, and this is the reason. Perhaps we could suggest, we could suggest why by Neris Chanukah, according to the Ritva, the Baal Habayis goes between the candle and the mezuzah with the talus, because sometimes the Jews in Greece share certain things. Greece is identified with Chachma, with wisdom. According to the Rambam, a lot of the wisdom that they have, the true wisdom that they might have, they got from Shem, from the Jewish people, but whatever it might be, they have skills. Chachma bagoyim tamin. It shouldn't just be rejected outright, the way some are rejecting medical advice today because it's science. But nevertheless, and Yafyo shel Shem, Yafyo shel Yefes, Ba'alo shel Shem. On the contrary, there's a concept that there are things of Yefes that we bring into the whole of Shem. The Gemara mentions that in the Megillah, and talking about writing, there was a special distinction in writing Sifrei Torahs in the Greek language, but there is a general concept. Of course, you have to be careful what you let Ba'alo shel Shem. And clearly that was the attitude of the Rambam, but the Rambam knew what to reject and what to accept. But I want to understand, what is this idea of this midah of tznius? The midah of tznius, and we see in Micha, Hatznei leches, in Hashem Elokecha, what does God ask of you? Not so much karbanos. Of course, there's a mitzvah karbanos, but the main thing is Hatznei leches in Hashem Elokecha. When you go with God, it's b'tznius. You recognize to a certain degree, if you get recognition of God's presence, but that has to be reflective of what you think of yourself also. You can't be arrogant. What is tznius? In English, we define tznius as modesty. But modesty, even in English, it's not just an external, it's not externalism, not just externalism. It's not just covering yourself up. Some people could cover themselves up in a way that it is a negation of tznius. It has to be an external manifestation of an internal feeling of modesty. And when we stand next to God, if one recognizes that he is in God's presence, how could he not have a feeling of modesty? Now, it's interesting, when it comes to Korach and Moshe, so one of the tests, Korach challenged Moshe Rabbeinu, and he said to Moshe, if someone has a talus that's full of tchelis, because under ideal circumstances, some of the strings of the tzitzis, there's a discussion how many which have to have the color tchelis blue. The nature of the blue is a dispute between Rashi and the Rambam. It was the blood of the chalazon. It was a dye taken from a certain water creature, and it was so. But he asked the Korach asked Moshe, according to the Medrash, if you have a beged that's completely blue with chelis, does it need strings attached to it or not? And Moshe said, yes, it needs strings. The chelis is only put on one, two, whatever the different opinions of the tzitzis that are attached to the garment. But you need the strings attached to the garment as well, and the chelis goes on some part of those strings. So Korach made fun of Moshe, and he took 250 Roshei Sanhedrios, 250 leaders of the Jewish people, 250 judges who sided with Korach, and he dressed them in a tallis that was completely blue that didn't have tzitzis. Why? It seems, and take a look in Parshas Dvarim also, Rashi mentions it, that the judges in those days, the judges used to wear a tallis that would cover themselves up. And so that was a sign of the Jewish leadership of the judges. They would wear a tallis. But what was the argument between Moshe and Korach? What is the Medrash trying to tell us? Okay, Parshas Korach comes immediately after the Parsha of Tzitzis. But what's the idea? And what's the idea? The Parsha of Vayomer. What's the idea? The idea is, what is blue? What is the chelis? Chelis represents Malchus, royalty. Mordechai, when he goes out before the king, one of the things he wears is chelis, is blue. Blue has always been identified with royalty. There was even a color called royal blue, even though chelis is not necessarily royal blue, but blue was always identified. As a matter of fact, the reason chelis went into disuse for many years was because the Romans did not allow the Jews to use chelis, because that was to be reserved for the royal officers of Rome. So that represents royalty. But what do the four tzitzis at the four corners represent? Four corners represents everywhere. Everywhere. God is everywhere. In a sense, it represents the tzitzis represents our being attached or tied to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. We are both royalty. B'nai B'chorei Yisrael. But at the same time, we are also servants of God. And the two have to go hand in hand. Korach why did he want Jewish leadership? Because Jewish leadership was a type of leadership that offered him the opportunity to take more and more. Korach saw Jewish leadership from the perspective of himself rather than giving to others. But Moshe Rabbeinu saw Jewish leadership as something that offered him the opportunity to give to others, not to take for himself. And when he defended his leadership, and Shmuel, when he defended his leadership, as Chamor Mila Kafti, did I take anything from anybody else? I didn't take anything from anybody else. Leadership to me was giving. It meant servitude, service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And as part of the service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu is service to Klal Yisrael, service to the Jewish people. And this was the idea of this was the idea also of the of Yehuda. Yehuda is identified with royalty. Yosef also is identified with leadership. Why? Because they give themselves over. They give themselves over. They understand that leadership is not just taking. It's not taking, but leadership is giving. And when Yehuda offers himself, so he's giving himself over. He's giving himself over for Yaakov. He's giving himself over for Binyamin. He's giving himself over for Klal Yisrael. And more important, he was ready to give himself over to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And an interesting, when the Nefesh HaChayim discusses the Neshama, when the Nefesh HaChayim discusses the Neshama, and the soul of man, according to Kabbalah, 3 parts, 5 parts. So the Neshama hovers, according to Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, over the head of man. According to Balatanya, it enters the head of man. And then you have Ruach, and then you have Nefesh. And Rabbi Chaim Volozhin explains it. He gives a mashal. He compares it to somebody blowing glass. When someone blows glass, so he has to use his breath. So the breath is when it's in the mouth, there is breath when it goes through the tube, and there is breath when it comes to a rest in the glass that is made. He says neshama comes from the word neshima, breathing. There is a constant connection between God and the Jewish people, and there is the breath of God, the neshama, the soul, and the neshama. According to many, it's not just for the Jews. It's also, there's a concept of neshama. It manifests itself different, even for non-Jews. But I'm talking now in terms of the Jewish people. The breath of God is the neshama is our neshama, the chel kaimimal, as it is in the mouth of God, the breath in the mouth of God. The ruach is as it goes through the tube, and the nefesh is when it comes to a rest. And this is constant. It's constant going on. In a sense, the Shama is what connects God with man. The neshama is what connects God with man. And this is the idea of tzitzis also. Tzitzis connects us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Korach wanted royalty, but he wanted to walk away with the royalty, even away from God. He did not want to be subservient to God. He did not want to have servitude to God. He wanted status from God, but not with God. And the idea of tzitzis is that we're connected to God. And this is the idea of tznius. The idea of tznius is that, on the contrary, it's our connection to God. And what is our connection to God? Our connection to God is the mitzvos. That represents the subservience to God. That's the Na'aseh v'nishma that Klal Yisrael said in Matan Torah when they were kish echad b'leiv echad. They were like one person with one heart. And when the Greeks tried to say that we were cut off from God, as the Maharal I mentioned in last week's share, the Maharal said that when they said Kisval Karen Shor Ein Lanu Chelek Belatei Yisrael, the Greeks wanted the Jewish people to write on the horn of an ox, we have no portion of the God of Israel. They were telling us that you were cut off from God. So we demonstrate when we stand by the doorway, no, we were not cut off from God. We continue to be connected with God. We are in the servitude of God. And it's our servitude that gives us our royalty. The tchelis has to be on the tzitzis. So that's why Chanukah we go. And this is a concept in Jewish leadership. Jewish leadership is a servitude. It's not, there is royalty that comes with it, but the royalty comes as a result of the servitude. And that's why the judges would wear a talus. Korach wanted the judges who supported him, they should see themselves only as royalty. So he put them in a talus shel tcheles. But our judges, even though today they don't do that, wearing talesim, but figuratively they have to understand, first of all, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we've learned that from Avram, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was always there when you have it in Torah. You have to be aware of God's presence in the Din Torah. We're in the presence of God. And when we think, we're not thinking of ourselves. We're thinking of the halacha. We're thinking what the halacha requires in this situation. We are tied to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when we're always in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but especially when people are involved in the Din Torah, they're in the presence of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The problem is today, very often Dayanim think about who is going to give them the most money. Today they don't pay outright bribes. Today you pay protection money. So they think of in terms of themselves, and because they think in terms of themselves, they'll really think the halacha is a certain way. Very often, I'm not talking against all judges, but very often that's the case. So because of that, the judges have to wear a talus to understand that when they're paskening, they're in the presence of God, and they're being held responsible to rule in accordance with the law of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, with the law of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So when we stand Chanukah, even though we revere Chachma, Chachma is very important. Medicine, when we have a shaila in medicine about Yom Kippur, whether a person should fast, a person shouldn't fast, we have to talk to a doctor. We understand medicine is important. In other areas also, we have to, Chachma is something that's very important. And if we identify Chachma with Yefes, it's Yafyo shel Yefes, Ba'alo shel Shem. We have to bring it in when we evaluate a shaila. But we have to understand there's a difference between our approach and the approach of the Greeks. The Greeks, Chachma was important by itself. To us, Chachma is important because God created the world by Chachma. As the Medrash tells us, with wisdom, HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the world. What do you mean? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is wisdom. But in other words, those are the laws of science. The world was created with laws of science. So we have to understand that yes, science is important, but it has a different meaning to us than it has to the Greeks. We might share science, but for us, it's in the sense of our recognition of fulfilling our role as the shaliach of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as the agents of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Asher bara l'kim lasos. God created the world for man to play a role in being his partner. And this is what the tzitzis reminds us of. And Chanukah, when we defeated the Greeks, we celebrated. We have to understand that even where we share certain things, it's altogether different. Okay.
If anyone has any questions, please put them in the chat.
I had one thing I just didn't answer. I just want to answer one thing. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't answer why Greece got kfura, why Yefes got kfura. Yefes was focused on the body. A body that's dead is in a disgraced form, and kfura covers up the body, whereas we focus on the neshama and the fact that we're always in the presence of God. So we got the mitzvah of tzitzis, which represents our commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and the different strands of the tzitzis and the knots of the tzitzis, that represents the mitzvahs HaTorah that connect us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
So also is the when we accept the mitzvahs of the Torah as going back to the first part of the share.
Yeah.
That v'ahavta l'recha kamocha includes the service of Hashem. How?
Because we accepted the Torah for all of the Jewish people, not just for ourselves. So the V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, that's part of Kabbalah HaTorah. That's the prerequisite for Kabbalah HaTorah.
Okay.
The foundation of Kabbalah HaTorah.
And what did the Ritva you said when Shem and Yefes covered up Noach? There was a Ritva who said something. What was that?
No,
Ritva?
no. The Ritva says that when you light Chanukah candles, he says his gears in the Gemara. I looked in the among the gear Girsis, but they didn't see it there. But the Ritva himself says that the Gemara says Ner Chanukah mismol mezuzah meyamin v'balabayis be'emtza atuf b'talis mitzuyetzes.
Okay.
Or going in between.
Yeah, I don't have any questions on the share. There is a question about your father's shita on adoption. Should we ask that now or talk outside?
I think if a person has a question about adoption, he should call
me. Okay.
Yeah.
About your father's opinion about yichud of an adoption.
Okay. All right. Well, let them call me.
Okay.
I'll certainly discuss it with them.
Okay.
Okay. That's fine. All right.
So if there's no questions, it was good to see everyone this week. Have a good, happy end of Chanukah, good Chodesh, and God willing, we'll see you next week.
Yeah. Okay. I'll be in touch.